Previously, on Lesson Symbolic Maturity 1, the left's learning problem. What orientation explains the left? What orientation explains the right? The hesitation, the confusion, the bewildered look. All to answer a simple question. Should I be afraid?
And when the forest would grow rank and needed clearing for new growth, I was there to set it ablaze.
Coming up next, I will teach you about the draining process. And there's a reason why I had to cut off things where I did. You'll see. Welcome to Lesson Symbolic Maturity 1, the left's learning problem, Chapter 1, Learning Itself, Subchapter 2, Basics in Political Literacy. With all this, however, we haven't explained one very important thing. Okay, we know the sides in politics, but what we don't know yet is why would there be a political evolution since this distinction was made. We don't yet know what explains politics. So what explains politics then? Well, think of the entirety of the political decisions going on in a region being a glass of liquid, let's say juice. Now, if the glass is full and with the same liquid, then that means that the political side to which that juice belongs to got everything that it wants for the efforts it tries to implement. Let's say that the left wants to pour strawberry juice and the right wants to pour lemon juice. Let's also say that it's somehow possible for any type of juice to be removed once poured, like if the split was 250 milliliters of strawberry juice and 250 milliliters of lemon juice, but the left wanted to get more of what it wanted, it could remove 50 milliliters of lemon juice without removing any strawberry juice. In the other way could also happen. So, what is happening with politics? Where are they progressing? Are we balanced? Are we more to the left, more to the right? Well, if we ask the left, they'll say that they are not represented in the neoliberal system, and fair enough. I mean, when was the last time you heard a politician campaign on abolishing money? I don't mean debt forgiveness, I mean pure abolition of money. One of the more advanced communist goals. Or campaign on mandatory co-ops as the only business model. Never, right? If anything, campaigns are on increasing taxes for the wealthy or a bigger welfare state. Then, if the left is not winning, getting stronger, and feeling represented, does that mean that the right is? No. Confused? Oh, my apologies. From my framing, I gave you the impression that there are only two sides in politics, the left and the right. That is not so. There is one more agent in the field with political interests. Well, if the left wants to pour one juice and the right wants to pour another, is there any other juice being poured? No, on the contrary. Remember when I said that the juice can be removed from the glass? If you remove juice in general from the glass or keep it at minimum levels, that means that the left doesn't get what it wants and the right doesn't get what it wants. So, who gets what it wants? In my analogy, this would be the glass itself. If there is no liquid, then no pressure is put on the glass, no load, the glass can exist freely. So, who is the glass in my analysis? The glass is the power apparatus itself, and in particular, the oligarchical elite class. The rulership of the status quo doesn't want to act for the sake of the right or the left. It wants to remain the oligarchy and act with impunity, without the standards of redistribution of resources by the left and without the standards of morality or upholding a culture by the right. So the glass gets drained by its liquid to consolidate the managerial elite. The glass gets increasingly empty, but this just explains the position of the left. In a sense, the left is right, it is not in control. But what explains the position of the right? Why does the right think that the left is in charge and that the deep and surface state is leftist? It's because, while both the left and the right are affected by the draining process, the right is affected by it faster. So if the glass would have begun in the 19th century having maybe 1/3 left liquid and 1/3 right liquid, what we have today is the glass contains 1/5 left liquid and 1/10 right liquid. So while the left is not gaining power, the right is losing power faster. In future chapters, you will see how this manifests in more detail. But why would this draining process target the right? That's because a living right is a bigger threat to the status quo than the left is, and its institutions would train people against oligarchic manipulation. But a limp right will only know to defend the ideal presented to them of what the institutions are supposed to represent. The right will convince itself that an institution is what it's supposed to be. That leads it even to help and work meritocratically in institutions aimed against them because they act according to principle, not for political gain. A couple of videos I recommend on these subjects are the following two by Aaron McIntyre. The right will defend the left from political consequences even when the left will attack it back when given the chance, and it's only in the past half a decade that there is a reliable section of the right that realized that if they try to save the left will try to destroy them. So now they increasingly are opposed to helping the left when it faces the consequences of its own actions. This is easiest seen in the free speech debate. The left likes to pretend that the right doesn't believe in it and free speech absolutism is an excuse to be bigoted and it won't defend the left, but getting the right to stop defending the left was a long process of souring the opinion of the right of what will happen if they help the left. And we reached the first donor exclusive segment. The segment in which I go into detail of a couple of cases on free speech being used against the right will be available on Substack, and you can follow me there with the usual subscription price. Let's return to what I spoke of, the draining process. Something else that points to it is that even our economies in the West have major leftist elements. The value structure of our economy and its underlying logic both appeal to the values of the left to the point that it's actually shocking, but I will go more over that in chapter 6. If you are politically savvy, you may notice that there is one more aspect of the question that was not answered. Why would the elite prefer a stronger left than a stronger right? That all comes down to the nature of the negative effects of capitalism, commodification and fungibility. Commodification refers to the process by which something is transformed into a commodity, a good or service that can be traded in the marketplace. Fungibility is the concept that refers to the property of a good or asset whose individual units are interchangeable and indistinguishable from one another. I presented a working definition of both because I might jump back and forth to presenting properties of both because they interrelate when it comes to this subject. To begin with commodification, I want you to listen to the following segment of a chit track and tell me if anything stands out to you.
Part 8. Who owns the new money? 5 bundles of new banknotes were sitting on the table. "Before distributing the money," said the banker, "I would like your attention. Now, the basis of all money is gold, and the gold stored away in the vault of my bank is my gold. Consequently, the money is my money. Oh, but don't look so discouraged. I'm going to lend you this money, and you're going to use it as you see fit. However, you'll have to pay interest. Considering that money is scarce here, I don't think 8% is unreasonable." "Oh, that's quite reasonable, Mr. Oliver." One last point, my friends. Business is business, even between pals. Before you get the money, each of you is going to assign a paper. By it, you will bind yourself to pay both interest and capital under penalty of confiscation of property by me. Oh, but this is a mere formality. Your property is of no interest to me. I'm satisfied with money. And I feel sure that I'll get my money, and that you will keep your property.
This, I believe, drives home on a visceral level the most wrong thing with commodification. What was commodified in this example? You only need to remember the phrase, "business is business, even between pals." When I first heard it, all I could think is, what a disgusting sentence. To understand that, let's look at an aspect of friendship and money. Why does money exist? Money is a token of exchange and it's supposed to represent a certain value that everyone, regardless of their feelings towards each other, can agree to use to exchange goods. To put it in more direct terms, money is a trust substitute for dealing with strangers. You don't know who those people are, but you know that their money is still money.
Hey, Water Tribe money.
I hope that's okay.
So long as it's money.
So what kinds of relations don't have to involve money? Well, more rarely you can have the occasional travelers who can work in exchange for food and shelter, but most often money exchange is not done in work friends and family members do for each other. Renovating a house and similar such laborious tasks, which you would normally have to pay for a stranger to do it. Yes, this also means that the feminist complaint of unpaid domestic labor is particularly distasteful. Anyway, back to commodities and fungibility. The more types of relations you monetize, the more people you treat like strangers, act which only serves the money interests. This is partly because monetizing relations with people which you had strong bonds with strains them. You lose the trust elements you have with them because by having favors and work done for each other be a monetary transaction, you treat your close circles like strangers through your actions. The best one could expect to do this with and not have it strain the relation is some project that you monetized in general, to which you offer discounts or occasional free provision of some items. Once the relations you have are strained, comes the issue of fungibility. If you treat your close ones as strangers, then as far as any money interest would be concerned, then what's the difference between interacting mainly with them or mainly with strangers? That way, at one's workplace, the fungible man is surrounded with strangers, and he could be replaced with little concern there. In public spaces, if the people around you are strangers, do they need to have the same religious beliefs as you? No. Do they need to share a history? No. To be the same ethnicity? No. Less and less commonality because you are fungible. You wouldn't care about this deracination and heterogeneity you have towards your society. When you interact with people, you can only keep relations at the most pleasantry level. Discuss activities that you do, what you watch, where you've been, with most of the focus on the fact that you consumed that thing. But do not discuss and bond over the kinds of people that you are and being better as that kind of people. Now that you know a little bit about commodification and fungibility, let's get back to the oligarchic elite and to why attack the right more than the left. There are a few reasons, but since we just spoke of fungibility, let's see what the elite gains from that. Well, if you are fungible, you can't hold as easily the elite to account, since you can't form as easily reasons to oppose to its behavior, or because of as many concerns. You don't share as much ground with your comrades to be protesting them together. Similarly, you can't as easily relate to the other members of your society, because in a distinct society, a lot of the values were implicit. They were common sense, but in a more diverse, fungible society, a lot of the things that were common sense earlier because of the common background that people have are now no longer common sense and need to be established formally if you are to do anything for a goal. In addition to this, there's another aspect of a diverse fungible society. In a diverse fungible society, you can get people who gain social status out of disruption, out of attacking a status quo or attacking constancy. Because exclusionary groups can't form, then social status will be gained by the groups that revert change in itself. So if you have one state of the culture changing, that culture will be seen in itself as good. This is the idea that multiculturalism is anti-culturalism, at least one of the ways to reach this observation. That's all good to know, but what may the left gain from fungibility? Well, I mentioned how the left's beliefs come out of access to luxury and indulging in it. In a more fungible role, just as you are replaceable, then just as easily you can go wherever you want. So if you want to be a global citizen and live in this place because it's cool, then in another place because it's also cool, now you can. And of discrimination, people are too demoralized because of their fungibility to care that you are there, so technically you wouldn't face discrimination because people wouldn't be motivated enough to defend their spaces to keep you out, if you have the money. And in this cosmopolitan dream, because everyone is everywhere, if a group wanted to form bonds and make a region exclusively of one religion or exclusively of one ethnicity, or other exclusion factors they want to make non-fungible, then every person who is not that group would get animated to suppress this effort in homogeneity, because, heaven forbid, they are excluded. In a weird way, the interests of the ruling elites, and more explicitly the interests of capital and the interests of the leftists align, but they are getting different things out of it. Communism collaborated with capitalism to destroy traditionalism. Capital got a population which can mostly relate only economically with each other, and communists got equality because every space is like every other, and it's hard to discriminate in any way except interpersonal, which is stigmatized. Let's take another example in terms of liberation. What of, for example, sexual liberation? Well, leftists want free love and to be with whoever they want, and capitalists, when sex is commodified, they can profit from selling it in advertisements. And since the purpose of sex in the sexually liberated society is not procreation, then there will be a lot of ways to make sure sex is infertile. Contraception has to be bought, doesn't it? There are also surgeries and other medical procedures to make sure pregnancy doesn't happen, and if it does, there are money to be made from terminating it too. Think for yourself now, what other ways can leftists and capitalists get something out of weakening something traditional? Moving on, I want to highlight 3 more reasons why the left is more susceptible than the right to the forces of capital and the elites. First is the revolutionary aspect of the left. In a revolution, a lot more effort is put into tearing the system down than building a system up. I will go over this later in some examples from the literature, but think, when was the latest time when you heard a leftist say, this won't happen after the revolution because... Probably never. That's because, as far as the leftist revolutionary is concerned, capital, not being in the hand of capitalists, plus a heavy dose of solidarity, trust me bro, will solve everything. Oh, and if it doesn't work, it's because we still have reactionaries in our midst. Meanwhile, some member of the elites will have tried to keep themselves elites in this new post-revolutionary system. They just need to not be too much in the public eye or present themselves in a positive light to the revolutionaries. Second reason I have left is the question of women. I mentioned earlier that leftists base their philosophy in conditions possible because of luxury. Well, the leftists would then simply promise this luxury to women to get them on their side. They'll be more liberated and thus won't have to listen to or consider men unless they want to, or even better still, at least as the propaganda is concerned, for things that they did have to consider men, like the provision of a husband, they now can get the same thing from a government program, colloquially called daddy state. Well, usually nanny state, but since we're talking about women, this is also a frequently used term. Now, women, instead of having to understand what men want and how to best relate to them, they can simply interact with the impersonal institution of the state, fill out a few forms and get the welfare or alimony or single mother program which the left promised to women, because now at least they don't have to be oppressed by the traditional relationship. Third reason relates to the second. These promises that the left makes to women, to people of various races and sexualities, what are they compared to? Think for a bit. You have what the left promises, and the alternative is what? Think back to what I said the right is about. The right wing has the values needed to survive and bring societies out of crises. In order to get out of a crisis and stabilize the situation, what do you need? You need to understand the real world, be grounded in it, and take decisions based off of it, even if those decisions are difficult. Now, the left, I said, has the values dependent on what one can afford with access to prosperity. This means that it is separated from the reality that it needs to do on the ground. It can simply want stuff because it wants stuff, not because they are possible. In other words, the left can compare what it wants to absolutely nothing. The choice the left is giving you is between the problem that they complain about and their imaginary world in which that problem doesn't exist. Now, does it make sense that it doesn't exist? It doesn't have to, because it hasn't been done. They just have to say that the problem would be fixed because they destroyed or acted against the bad thing in the present, and they don't have to worry about the limitations of the real world.
So again, going back to this statement here about what's being told to young people.
These women are often really young. in their 20s, and they're preaching the values of submitting to a husband to an audience of other young women.
Again, excluding what happens to children at air quote family-friendly events, what have you guys been telling women in their 20s? Feminism has constantly been telling women to wait to have kids for things like a career, instead of doing a very obvious adjustment, which is to have kids young and then spend the second half of your life, which spans decades, working on a career.
No one really is thinking that 30 is too late at all.
Yeah, well, it turns out that life is shorter than people think. I've had clinical clients who followed that path, and some of them were women who had initially decided that they didn't want to have children and then changed their minds quite dramatically in their late 20s, which is a very common pattern, and then couldn't have children. And it was just absolutely disastrous for them. They were often on the artificial fertility route for 10 years with multiple miscarriages and failures on that front.
And this is all assuming that working a career is the ultimate path to satisfaction, which is what Novara Media and books like The Feminine Mystique are suggesting. They say that housework and chores are boring and monotonous. However, a career can be just that as well, and that's assuming that you get a good one and you aren't working a career at Starbucks or a grocery store. Most of the fulfilling careers that Betty Friedan talked about in her book were arts careers, to which you are incredibly lucky if you are financially successful in. Most artists are failures. I did notice in the parts that I read that Betty didn't mention construction as a career path for women, but also stuff that sounds good like discovering the cure for cancer can be incredibly monotonous. Do you have any idea how boring lab work is? So if you're unfulfilled as a housewife, then you are probably going to be unfulfilled in a career, except now your kids will be raised by the government or some minimum wage daycare employee instead of by their parents. Though the actual answer is less about having a career and more about figuring out some sort of lifelong goal to serve that piques your interest. However, that's not really what this Novara Media video is about. It really just seems like a hit piece that's not about solving a problem, but more about making political opponents look bad. Thus, it's propaganda. You can tell because not only do they provide no solutions for a problem that they are discussing, but also, all the presenter does is name call and relate being a housewife to things that the left hates, instead of actually responding to the argument.
Leftists compare realities with their imagination instead of comparing it to your real life, a strategy of bribery to get on board with them. You don't have to compare a real problem with a real solution. You can simply act as if, when you'll be in charge, the problem won't exist. And the right puts up with this.
As I have discussed before, that we have 5 moral foundations, the group-oriented foundations of obedience to authority, of in-group loyalty, and of sanctity versus disgust, i.e. that you sanctify that which is good for the group and you taboo that which is bad for it. And we have these help because groups that are high in internal cooperation dominate other groups in group selection, but then you have to get to the top of the group. So there's the individually oriented foundations of equality, where you make sure that you get more of the pie, basically, everyone's more quite similar and feels contented, and harm avoidance, which avoids harm to you. Conservatives are about the same in all 5 moral foundations. Liberals are high only in the 2 individually oriented foundations. And this makes sense because liberals are high in mental instability, and liberals on average are also physically weak and physically ugly. A lot of studies on this. And so the only way they can get power, they fear a fair fight in terms of attaining power. And so the only way they can get power is via virtue signalling about equality and harm avoidance, i.e. leftism. And that is precisely what they do. So that is the nature of the left, and that is why leftism is associated with these moral foundations and these selfish moral foundations. But what it means, of course, is there is asymmetrical empathy between conservatives and liberals. Conservatives, all 5 moral foundations are important. Liberals are selfish. It's only the 2 individually oriented foundations, and that means conservatives will give ground to liberals because there's asymmetrical empathy. And also because of the nature of the conservative. Studies on people that are conservative indicate that, unlike liberals, they are low in neuroticism, so they are happy people. They are high in a sense of agency, i.e. they feel they have a sense of power. They feel they have power. They feel they have control. Whereas liberals feel that life is chaos and they have no power and they have no control, and so they strive for it. Conservatives feel the world's fundamentally fair, whereas liberals, almost like teenagers, feel it's so unfair, I hate you. Conservatives feel in control, and so the tendency of conservatives is just to give in to the liberals. And what this means, of course, is that you get you get more and more liberal signalling and signalling about equality and harm avoidance until we get to a point where you can't hurt the feelings of a transgender person by making them go on a ward consistent with their biological sex, where you can't even say that sex is biological because it hurts people's feelings, where you can't even say that sex is biological because it goes against equality. And this carries on until the conservatives are unhappy, until too many people feel that their moral foundations are not attended to, until you have extreme concern with the individually oriented moral foundations and no concern with the group oriented foundations, sanctity, truth, disgust, things like that. And this carries on until there is a reaction, and then you get a conservative reaction.
For as soon as the distribution of labor comes into being, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or a critical thinker, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. While in communist society, where nobody has exclusive sphere of activity but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. Karl Marx, The German Ideology. This is on Feuerbach, Introduction to the Critique of Political Economy. I dare you to tell me that there's a more luxurious, life on easy mode, bourgeois sentiment that you've ever heard in your life. And this one comes from Karl Marx himself. I mean, come on. There is one more reason why the draining process prefers the left over the right to be the one which inches forward more effectively, even while losing ground. The right, I'm not talking in the abstract, but as it proves itself to be, the right is satisfied with the illusion of power. The left is not satisfied without the monopoly on power, and it's more than willing to sabotage and destroy everything that stands in the way of that absolute dominance. To exemplify this, I want you to think of a hierarchy, any hierarchy, for executing policy. Now, I want you to think of how the right acts during elections. It acts as if taking the top of the hierarchy does something. Let us think though of the Trump presidency. What was the state of the entire political apparatus? Trump had some supporters, sure, but the entirety of the rest of the apparatus was there to hinder him. The exceptions, which were Trump's support like Fox News, were singled out as an anomaly to ridicule, and every other organization referred derogatorily to it and to people who liked those sources of support.
But I thought that we could defeat their ideas with better ideas, and if that failed, then I thought we could march ourselves down to the ballot box and have our say that way. But I don't even know how much trust I have in that process anymore.
She's acting like such a victim, frankly, as though her ideology is losing in America. Does Sydney know who the president is? Does Sydney know which party is currently ruling the United States and had the majority in both houses of Congress before too? I mean, granted, you lost it at the midterms, but that was because we had better ideas. She's just alarmist, and she's alarmist against liberal tyranny when her frickin' party is the one in power right now.
That, having the main figure position be red, is all the right needs to believe it is in charge, and it's all the left needs to act like the right is in charge. I also have to include the hilarious, I'm a blue supporter in a blue city and I like it, why don't you?
And slavery is still, it absolutely still exists in the United States. Just look at the prison system. Sydney, let me ask you, what's it like watching somebody whose opinions actually have depth? All right, she goes on to complain about blue cities and what it's like to live there. It's super boring, so I'm going to get to the next interesting part. But for the record, I live in a blue city. I quite like it. It's quite nice.
We'll see about that in chapter 5. Anyway, even with a right-winger formally in charge, that doesn't mean he has significant mandate to change things when he has almost no support and every other part of the system fights against him, which brings us to how the right treats the idea of politics. The right wants to pretend that every time they're about to be in charge, and once they're in charge, they can just implement a platform and all they need to do now is construct combinations of policies that they need to list to get their way. Meanwhile, what actual politics involve are, if I were to describe in one word, reinforcing. To be good at politics, you need to exist in a sea of organizations that assist each other and offer opportunities to each other in different areas of life, and for that, the right needs active participation of its members.
So, for instance, let's review this, and let's review what when people say, why aren't you doing something? Why aren't you doing something? Why aren't you actually trying to change policy? Okay, so there's the Otto von Bismarck style of politics where you are an actor that has power and you're acting in this moment to increase your power and to make sure that your power, the scarce resource that it is actually used to make sure that your vision comes into existence in the most effective way and that you're actually using your power as it is to increase your share of power. That's how politics existed for Otto von Bismarck. He was a political actor and he was using power he actually had. He was not a political theorist or spectators or people who talk about ideas in the abstract like you and I are talking right now. Maybe this is something that is deceptive for people who are watching this on YouTube. I'm just sitting here in my house in a room with a Yeti microphone speaking into it and talking to you about my political opinions. I don't have levers here that control what Congress does. I don't have Ron DeSantis' number on my cell phone so I can just call him up. This is us discussing politics in the abstract. There's nothing I know of that I can do aside from voting, which in the states I am is incredibly meaningless, that can actually impact these things. So in the Otto von Bismarck sense, what can we actually do? Well, we can build community locally, which if you know anything about what I talk about on this channel, I talk about this all the time. I talk extemporaneously about this in terms of building community, in terms of family, in terms of church, in terms of local political organizations. And if all that is just way too abstract, we are literally pushing forward meetup communities and fraternal societies that I advertise for all the time. And this is something that is not an abstract hypothetical I'm talking about. This is something that you can actually do. Either building community, solidarity, and incorporating these ideas into your actual local life community, or using the resources we're provided to meet up. Another thing we could do, and some people have done this, building institutions, publishing houses, homeschool networks, fraternal societies like the OGC. I hate to constantly harp on this, but this has been, the third or fourth event we've done this year. And it's amazing how many people are actually building small little institutions like this in our network. Are they all going to succeed? No. But this is actually doing something in a realistic way. This is not theory. This is actually doing something. If people are kind of confused as to what that actually means. Another thing is fraternal housing networks. This was a big. Well, it wasn't a big. It was one lecture, but created a bunch of discussion at the recent OGC conference. Was essentially building fraternal organizations and housing networks that had essentially discretional abilities to associate with each other, so that wealth could be traded internally, and that organization could be done on the inside of these organizations, something that's hard to do without a lot of legal planning or know-how. And I'm very glad that people put effort towards that. Organizing politically in real life, like I said before, going to your local city council meeting, creating political parties. One thing that I was pushing, although this was not one of the lectures given at the last conference, was this idea of automated voting, which I still think is the absolute future of political engagement in this country. Political engagement has to essentially be automated such that organizations like the OGC simply have blocks associated with them. So as opposed for me figuring out who I want to vote for organized dog catcher, I just vote OGC ticket. Or what would be better is to kind of hoist the State Department by its own petard and just pick a color. Like, the color of the OGC is, I don't know, teal. So I joined the Teal Coalition. And the Teal Coalition, organized by the OGC, tells me how to vote for all of these minor down ticket ballots that I would ordinarily care about. And if this Teal Coalition gets large enough, it will start flipping a bunch of the minor government positions that nobody cares about, which means that if you want a minor government job that no one cares about, you have to start talking to the Teal Coalition. That builds power in an organized way that is time efficient. And although I think people are starting to implement this, and this is certainly a theoretical idea, incrementing this idea forward would actually build power. It would actually get us power. And I'll say this too here, further down the list, publishing books, publishing theory, making art. This is something that's kind of a cliche. People roll their eyes at this. This is the Curtis Yarvin idea of planting acorns. And especially in an election year, people will just kind of dismiss this or scoff at this as intellectual wankery. This is just, look, we're red pilling the normies. We're doing our own thing. Look at us. Cue the meme that Scrump Monkey always likes to repeat on Twitter, where it's Todd Flanders having an imaginary victory where he's red pilling the normies with art or whatever, because you can't see the results of this. But this isn't what the internet means by doing things. What the internet means by doing things is crafting hypothetical policy positions, like hypothetical Republican Party platforms, and pretending like you are on the cusp of getting elected as a Republican, or you are in the inner circle of someone like Ron DeSantis, or, maybe you're a political operator like Chris Rufo, although most of what Chris Rufo does is this green section over here. Most of what Chris Rufo does is just investigative journalism, and every now and again he probably has lunch with a politician who actually can influence policy. Most of it's creating content, organizing, and doing investigations. That's what political... I mean, he did something that was really great this last week. He published an expose on a bunch of transgender clinics in the United States and the abusive practices that went on in there, and the weird government involvement at that level, which is an amazing piece of expose journalism. And I very much admire Rufo, despite the fact that I do think many of the criticisms that Yarvin and Aaron make of him are accurate. But what the internet wants you to do is they want you to imagine that you're Ron DeSantis or someone more powerful than Ron DeSantis, or the person that's crafting the policy proposal in the think tank that is imminently going to become the first iteration of Ron DeSantis's policy in his first 100 days of being president. And by putting this set of policy proposals together, you're going to change policy, and this is going to be the roadmap for actually accomplishing change. The thing is that this thing in red here that the internet thinks of as doing things, this is just creating political content. It's just talking about politics in the abstract, because none of us are actually advisors to Ron DeSantis. None of us are actually crafting policy in this dimension. We're just sitting here talking about politics. We're creating political content. Now, there could be uses. If it would help people, we can go through hypothetical policies, and we're going to do that today. Or we're gonna go through somebody else's, and then I'm going to craft a response of my own, and we're going to contrast my response to this mystery person's ideas. And we're going to see how that works out. But we need to get something clear right now. Discussing hypothetical policy ideas is not doing something. it's only doing something in that it creates political content. It is not doing something in terms of all of these other green things. It is not actually talking about or controlling levers that we actually have power over. And rest assured, by the time you think of this super specific, super relevant policy idea that, Ron DeSantis, if he were elected president, or Trump, if he were elected president, could just come into office and do in his first 100 days, that genius, sort of very, very narrowly tailored policy idea, that's going to be irrelevant in 5 months tops. Don't even bother writing a book on it the way that R.N. McIntyre wrote The Total State or Nina Parvini wrote the Populist Delusion, because by the time that comes around, by the time you publish it, it will already be irrelevant because the political situation will have already changed and you're going to be stuck with a bunch of sawdust.
Ask yourself a few questions. How many of the people you know are aware of the state of politics? And in how many aspects of lives do they have the backing for political goals? Are you in a place you want to be? Is there economic security or religious support? Is the media you consume on your side? Are the activities you take part in, the norms you live by, the politicians in your area favorable to you? How many of these things do you have? Can you list them? Without them, the range of possibilities of your political action shrinks. If you have a platform without having what to back it in, all that needs to happen is for someone to call your bluff. That's why one side of my channel will be the exploration of how to make and what to talk about in various groups that the right forms, how it needs to think about stuff to gain friends and not inspire enemies, what to fill one's time with in groups organized by oneself or where one is a major contributor, what to devote more time to and what to ignore. This is what you will find on my channel in the following couple of years, which, if I get your support, I will be able to devote more time to and find more voices to offer you the resources and experience of.
What I have right now, in most cases in human history, would have been considered the absolute lap of luxury for anyone living in anything approaching our species' normal conditions of existence. Do I feel like a king? Hell no, I feel like an ordinary workaday schlub because I am thinking like a human, and because everyone else around me has this, and because this is the norm, I obviously take this for granted. and finally, normies always assume that the best thing will happen to them in any random development, which is, of course, the exact opposite of Murphy's Law. Additionally, I'm going to introduce here the fundamental law of democracy. And the fundamental law of democracy is that when uncontrolled, democratic bodies do not act tactically. They return to the preferred behavior of their median member. So, for instance, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party's tendency is always to give in. Therefore, always to give in to the Democrats, right? So, therefore, in absence of anyone guiding them or overviewing their decisions or making them make the right choices, they will inevitably just compromise and try to get money brought into their home districts. That's their natural tendency. That's how they have been trained. The Democratic Party is a party of activists. Their inclination is to naturally get more money and gibs for constituent victim groups. So in the absence of any control or oversight, they will always try to grab more funding for their constituencies. And with those two observations, you can pretty much predict how Congress is going to act. But we can't predict otherwise. And, people are, what's so unusual about this? This fundamental law of democracy isn't even very interesting like the last ones were. Well, you see, this is very, very important when we get to the next fundamental law here. Now, this fairy that contacted me, this ghost of the past, Otto von Disney, he is very, very fond of these things called compromises. Compromises are something that's been a staple of the democratic political order since the beginning of our constitutional republic, and probably even before under the Articles of Confederation, and actually even during the signing of the Declaration of Independence by Benjamin Franklin. And well, Thomas Jefferson wrote it, and then Benjamin Franklin and John Adams edited the hell out of it. It was a collective document. It was the work of many hands, and compromises had to be made. And of course, when the Constitution was signed, compromises had to be made. And when the debates on slavery raged, compromises had to be made. And when the New Deal happened, compromises had to be made. And when the Hart-Celler Act and the 1964 Civil Rights Amendment happened, compromises had to be made. Now, if you are a studier of political history like I am, you might ask yourself, and I'm going to hide my video. Well, maybe I will. I might. Let me discuss this. If you study political history like I have, and you look at all of the compromises made in our country or in other people's country democratically in bodies like the Grand Assembly or Congress in the United States or Parliament in the United Kingdom, you might be asking yourself, who wins the compromises? These compromises are between belligerent parties. They have diametrically opposed ideas on how the country is going to ultimately evolve. What causes one side to win a compromise and one side to lose a compromise? Is there any rule that dictates who wins and who loses? Or do both sides win? Or can both sides win? Let's put aside whether both sides win or whether the compromise can ever be completely mutually beneficial, because I think that when we look at most of human history and we look at the various compromises that have been made, especially over the course of the United States, you'll realize quite definitively that one side got what they wanted and the other side got screwed. Now, is there a universal quality that separates the winners from the losers in this fundamental art of the compromise? Well, it's because the winners understand the fundamental law of compromises. And here I'm going to hide my video and we're going to discuss the fundamental law of compromises. A compromise between two parties in the present does not bind the actions of said parties in the future. I'm going to say that again. I'm going to say that again twice. A compromise between parties in the present does not bind the actions of said parties in the future. A compromise between parties in the present does not bind the actions of said parties in the future. Throughout our history, the party that has understood this has won, and the party that has understood that has lost. Now, what does this mean? What this means is, except in periods of exceptional order and trust, where both parties are just so religiously dedicated to their word that they are frozen in amber to the words that they have signed on this document, which happens very, very rarely and only in early periods of civilization, which we're certainly not in. In anything other than those circumstances, a compromise is made one day, and then immediately the question comes afterwards. Okay, now that I got what I wanted from this compromise, how can I use this to get more power and make sure that what the other person got doesn't actually happen? Right? Some people might remember a certain compromise that Reagan made, exchanging amnesty for border enforcement. I remember that compromise. It was the most recent compromises in recent history. The Democrats certainly got amnesty for all illegal immigrants in the 1980s. That definitely happened. Did Reagan get his border enforcement? Speaking as a Californian, that would be no. And that's because the act of amnesty made the enforcement of the border harder. The same thing is true for the slavery compromises. You get concessions on slavery in the short term. The other side gets states that vote against slavery in the long term. Who wins that compromise? It's not hard to see who. There's always a side that wins a compromise, and the side that wins the compromise is the one that can use the compromise to get more power, where the other person has some kind of symbolic little bauble that they can hold up and go, look, 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 I got this little bauble. That's a compromise. This is an achievement because I made the compromise. And this compromise, of course, will last forever. No one will betray this compromise. And even if they do betray the compromise, the fact that they betrayed the compromise is a moral victory for me because it will demonstrate the fact that they have broken the sacred compromise. Does anyone not vote Democrat? I mean, I guess some white people in California don't vote Democrat because they broke the great compromise with Ronald Reagan, but it's a pretty minuscule percentage of the population. In 10 years, nobody remembers the ink of the sacred compromise you signed. What people do remember is which side gained power from it. And why do they do that? Because compromises between parties in the present do not bind the actions of said parties in the future. They can undo that compromise. And furthermore, if the compromise is give me something now, so I get something later, you can take what that person gives you now and never give them what they want in the future, because by the time what they want by the time the future comes, you could be out of office, people could have forgotten the compromise, you could have passed additional laws that amend the compromise using the power that you got now. If you do not understand this law, your compromises will suck.
In conclusion, why does the draining process prefer the left? It's because of the different reactions of the left and the right. The right will not notice a takeover. The left will actively break down everything that stands in the takeover's way and prevent the barriers from being built back up. Then it will consider building up barriers to their unrestricted flow of power to be fascism or ending democracy. I do not expect you to fully believe this from what I presented so far, but that's what the rest of this episode is for. You will find clues for this being the state of things from the various reactions in the chapters that I will publish after this one. Unfortunately, I had more to discuss, and more of a different nature to say about the basics in political literacy, so this subchapter will be continued in part 3. Meanwhile, I'll leave you with a parting message.
Fight for our children! Our children's children, so they will not carry these marks.